Welcome everybody. In this session, I'm speaking to three experts to find out more about the potential for creating change on a city level and what the future of our cities could look like. And sorry for the all-male panel. We did have a female speaker programme, but unfortunately today she's been unable to join us. So let's welcome our panellists. Thank you, all of you, for being here. Why don't each of you introduce yourself, tell me what your organisation's been doing specifically to support cities to tackle waste and scale reuse systems. Magash, shall we start with you?
Perfect. Thanks, Natalie. And thank you for the invite to be part of the panel. So I'm Magash Naidoo. I'm from an organization called ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability. I'm based in Bonn, and our ultimate mandate is to work on sustainability at city and subnational level, primarily for sustainable urban development, if I could use the catchphrase. And we work thematically on a few areas, one being circularity.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for being here today. Looking forward to gleaning your knowledge and wisdom across that later on. Matt, let's hear from you.
Hi, Natalie. It's great to be here. My name is Matt Littlejohn. I work for Oceana. We're a global ocean conservation advocacy organization, and our mission is to protect the world's oceans. And we do that by winning policy victories from cities, other local governments, and also national governments, as well as we have a corporate campaign function, which I lead as well too. And did I answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, specifically, I think you've done some work specifically around refill and reuse in cities as well.
Yes, exactly. And we operate. We're in 12 countries, and we're some of the largest cities in the world. So we've been very successful in using those governments to actually push for change. So there's a lot of opportunity, I think.
Amazing. Thank you. Good to have you here. And last but not least, over to Jack.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation to join. My name is Jack McQuibben. I'm the head of local zero waste implementation at Zero Waste Europe. We're based in Brussels. We're an NGO pushing for a zero waste society. And what we do with municipalities here is we help them design and implement zero waste strategies. And what this means is that they sort of community-centered policies within a united framework to obviously help prevent waste and create systems that do that. And we have a zero waste city certification with nearly 500 municipalities throughout all of our work now that are committed to be zero waste, and these implement reuse, refill, and other sort of key prevention strategies, as well as, of course, looking at sustainable sort of treatment for residual waste, minimizing that, and of course separate collection and recycling. And Zero Waste Europe is also part of Gaia, a global organization with the European chapter, and there are zero waste cities in Asia and Africa and other regions as well. So I'll be touching on those during today's panel.
That's really exciting. Thank you, Jack, and thank you all of you. I'm looking forward to diving into the wisdom in the room. So let's start with Magash by looking at breaking down what we mean when we talk about cities. So when it comes to your work, who are the key stakeholders in cities that are involved, and how important do you think it is to influence at every level?
So very interesting question, Natalie. And I think there's some nuance to this answer depending on where you go in the world. Fundamentally, I mean, cities are a really complex piece of machinery, right? It's kind of the basic platform for life as we know it to exist, right? What I'm alluding to is all stakeholders are important when we talk about cities. Businesses are important, civil society is important, academia is important, and then multi-level governance is important. So one cannot pick and choose who the important stakeholders are. Holistically, all stakeholders are important. I think the nuance here is that depending on specific activity that you're undertaking, some stakeholders become a bit more important to deliver on some of these aspects. However, communication and trust needs to be kind of the underpinning. So even if some stakeholders are not actively involved in specific initiatives, there still needs to be this communication channels that is opened up to all stakeholders. So people are aware, they're bought into processes, and they take ownership of cities.
I guess we can add to that as nature being one of those stakeholders as well, of what we're all Absolutely. About, what we're all about here today. Thank you. Yeah, I can see that, certainly different people might have more different influence, and quite often as well who can help fund these transitions can tend to have a bit more power in those situations as well. Matt, with the work that you've done on cities, how big do you think the opportunity is? I mean, presumably, if we can get this bit right of people refilling and reusing in cities, it's going to solve a significant part of the puzzle and enable us to really drive the transition from single use to reuse. Tell us your thoughts on.
Oh, sorry. You're right. It's a huge opportunity. Cities, are really the key to the solution to solving the waste problem that our oceans face and that our planet faces, because that's where people live and that's where the bulk of waste generation is happening. The good news is that's also where the reuse solution is strongest in many ways. Some of the biggest cities in the world are leaders in reuse because they've never gotten rid of it. So Mexico City, Buenos Aires, Rio, Sao Paulo, also Berlin and Manila all have very strong existing systems with reuse, mainly in the beverage sector. And it's a
Sorry, Matt, can I just say, did you say in the fabric sector?
In the beverage sector, in beverages.
Beverage, thank you.
So in beverages, yeah, it's the old system with how the world basically, got its drinks, which was we used to have a 100% reuse system until the 70s, 80s, and 90s. It's no longer extant in much of Europe, in the US. So there tends to be a feeling that this is an old idea that, we can't do this anymore, blah, blah, blah. But in reality, it is not. It's continued on in these very large cities. A lot of companies have innovated there, cities have innovated, and there's actually very sophisticated systems where they use, alternative energy to power these washing plants. They've used advances in reverse logistics, become very, very good at getting, the containers back. So this model exists and, can be expanded. There's an existing infrastructure to expand largely in big cities is where the heart of it is. And there's potential to do this, everywhere else where you can actually kind of transfer the system. To me, like I work a lot in plastics, and one of the things you hear a lot in plastics is kind of this desire to find a magic material, right? A plastic that will somehow disappear when we throw it into a bin, like a recycling bin or trash bin, and then come back to us magically. Like this material will solve our problems, but in reality, the solution to our problems is reverse logistics, which if you think about it is what's driven a lot of the economic growth in cities and elsewhere recently. We're very, very good at that. And these systems exist. They're not, unlike the magic plastic substance, which is more of a hope and an idea. This is a reality. And I think cities can really drive this change, both by enabling the businesses that can do this to do more of it, but also by driving policy change too, to encourage it as well. We did a study about a year or two ago, and we found that just a 10% increase in the use of what we call refillable bottles or reusable bottles could take as many as 7.6 billion bottles out of the ocean every year. Just 10%. That's a fluctuation that already happens in many of these markets. So anyway, it's super exciting. We love to see other big cities kind of follow the lead of these cities, mainly in the global south. One of the weird things is a lot of the kind of thought leadership is in the global north, but actually the innovation in this area is in the global south. So there tends to be sometimes kind of a blindness to what's happening, which is super exciting. So anyway.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. That's a great statistic. And I think when I was researching this discussion as well, came across that. And I just think it's incredible. It's something like just by reusing 10% of our plastic products, we can prevent something like 50% of annual plastic.
By increasing the share by 10%, but yeah, it's not a lot. I mean, it varies. It already varies, with some of these markets by 5 or 10% annually anyway. And now the companies, we need to get them to actually get people to, want to buy it. It's historically been a low-cost product. It's existed because it's a cheaper way to get the product because you don't have to buy the container once. And so it fluctuates with economic times. But so now the key is to get people to say, hey, this is great. I'd like to do this. It's pretty cool too, because, like a lot of plastic solutions are kind of, they're not cheap, right? This is actually an affordable way to solve the problem for use.
Yeah, and that's hopeful. I mean, those smaller numbers. We don't need everybody to convert to it. So yeah, but sometimes here in European cities, it can feel like we've got a long way to go. And certainly at London on lunchtimes, when I'm seeing bins overflowing, it's great to hear that other cities are still using those old sort of reverse logistics systems. Jack, what do you think around some of the challenges faced by cities around the world? Obviously, some are doing it, but if you could maybe provide a global perspective on what the challenges are to cities reintroducing those systems or actually developing those systems, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, of course. I think the first thing is to look at the macro level. So there's huge vested interests in terms of keeping the flow of plastics at the current levels. It's just the petrochemical industry saying they see losing profits in energy, people moving towards renewable energy sources rather than oil, and they see plastics as their cash cow. So that's important to know. But then for cities, it's a number of factors. I think what we lack is a kind of a level playing field for reuse. And this results in cities not having accessible or citizens not having accessible or affordable alternatives for reuse. In many circumstances, it's more expensive to buy fruit or vegetables that's not covered in plastic than the ones that are covered in plastic. And why is that? And the system, therefore, is built around not externalizing the costs of the environment. So that's really key. But then what we talk about here in Europe, and I think globally in particular, there needs to be a level playing field in terms of the harmonization of standards, what it is to be reused in terms of the kind of materials that are safe to use within a system. Is it a pooled system or is it a privatized system is really important. If you're talking about deposit returns, how much is the deposit, what materials? At the moment, it's very fragmented. There are some good practices, but they're happening sporadically, and there's no sort of legislative framework enacted. Sometimes in national level, but what we really need is at the European level here, but in globally in other areas too. So I think that is really important. And one area that affects globally in particular is a lack of enforceable extended producer responsibility schemes. So companies like Pepsi, Coca-Cola, Nestle continue to put on single-use sachets, a common problem in many parts of Africa and Asia, and they face no fee, no cost for this in terms of the cleanup. This is all put on cities and therefore citizens through their waste fees. And so therefore, without EPR to sort of say, hey, polluter pays, you put this non-recyclable material on the market, you should pay for its cleanup and its treatment. Without that system in place, there's no real incentive to change. And therefore, cities have to they're at the lowest point of this chain, and they're the ones who have to put up with the long-term impacts of this. So, I mean, there are some of the key core challenges that really prevent further systemic change happening in this area.
Thanks, Jack. So just reflecting back, it's sort of an access issue for a lot of people, of it being inclusive and affordable for them to make that transition. And that applies to businesses too, doesn't it? Of those entry points of businesses wanting to take on washing facilities or that sort of thing. And then you mentioned the all-important policy. So I think I'll come to you, Magash, next, because you recently were in Paris for the plastic treaty negotiations. So maybe you could talk to us a little bit about that and provide some context of how important getting these policies on a city level right is if we're going to create meaningful change.
So that's a rather complex question, Natalie. I would go so far as to say, I mean, if we're concerned about taxes, if we're concerned about pollution in our environments, there's no taking this away from the policy discussion, right? Because this is where it all starts. What I observed during INC2 in Paris last week was quite interesting. There's definitely the right intentions in the room in terms of trying to eliminate plastic waste. But unfortunately, there's no getting away from vested interests. I think Matt mentioned earlier on, and Jack also alluded to it, about fossil fuels and business, right? I mean, economies cannot take a knock, and this then has a further knock-on impact in terms of just transition, jobs. It's a really complex space, and one has to approach these things very carefully so we're not resulting in negative unintended consequences. What we've seen thus far, though, is lots of mention of stakeholders broadly, and stakeholders are a wide category of organizations, and this includes academia, business, local governments, and so on and so forth. There's been minimal specific mention of cities and subnational governments, but my reading into the situation is that from the two very different positions that are emerging from this negotiation process, all of the interventions will come back to cities in one form or the other. As Jack mentioned, closest form of government to people and the problem. And this language is not currently in the discussions, but there is some hope because we're early on in the process. INC3 is taking place in Kenya. I think it's November 2023. And we're hoping that by this time, and by the time the zero draft comes out, there is some strong language that give consideration to the issues that cities have. So what are the negative social implications? Are we just going to have huge swathes of industry, closing down, and then what happens to this space? Really complex, but I'm hopeful that narrow economic interests can be put aside for eliminating plastic. Not just pollution, but we know that there's also a lot of toxicity in plastic, and this we ultimately consume. So not just a plastics pollution, but also plastics pollution problem, but also a health problem as well. I just want to, maybe before we move on, Matt mentioned something very interesting about the economics, about reusable bottles and potentially saving this large quantity of single-use bottles from using one reusable bottle. And I fully agree. The economics work, the environmental benefits work, but what I'm seeing and noticing is that we need to really start taking holistic approaches to this, because if we don't start focusing on behavioral change, then whatever fantastic infrastructure solutions we provide, this is not going to be adopted.
Well, obviously, I'm delighted to hear you say that, Magash, because that's all about what we do at City to Sea and through the Refill campaign and days like World Refill Day. So, good to know we're all playing our part. So, Jack, in terms of examples from cities around the world, I can think of examples where cities maybe have a more visionary leader who's implemented some, they have a bit more power in certain different cities or setups. So maybe you could give us some examples of cities where it's really working and how they did it.
Definitely. So I think let's start with some immediate measures that cities have done. So we're looking at kind of bans or ordinances to install bans on single-use plastic items and other kind of taxes. And I think one of the best examples we have on taxes at the moment can be from Europe and the German city of Tübingen, which recently was took to court. First of all, they installed a tax on single-use plastic cutlery and packaging in local shops within the city. That was they were taken to court by the local McDonald's, and then they won that case saying that it was justifiably fair, and the deposits were the right size. So this is a key example of basically what a city can do within their immediate jurisdiction to install economic incentives to encourage reusable items. So that's one great example, Tübingen in Germany. Secondly, if you look at bans, there's San Fernando in the Philippines, and they introduced a plastic-free ordinance focusing immediately on single-use plastic bags, so for food, from markets. Then it sort of developed into a broader look at other single-use items that were the most common there. And the key thing about these best practices is it's not just sort of overnight. You don't install a kind of a change in legislation and then it changes. You need to do a transition. You need to support businesses. You need to engage citizens, as you mentioned there, and you take it on a phase-by-phase journey. And that's what both cities have showcased, which I think is really important. We talk about refill and reuse. There are some great examples of looking at specifically at public procurement and in public events. And so what can municipalities do directly to say, okay, here's what we will help install a reuse culture. And so you have examples from Ghentfest, the city of Ghent in Belgium, that has installed, they have a festival that sort of a two-week long festival, over 1 million people attended, and they force businesses to use reusable cutlery, cups, and cutlery, and that sort of, has reduced waste, I think, by a huge amount, in terms of 30-40% in a couple of years, which is incredible. And then other examples from Hoi An in Vietnam, which is really interesting place because they basically introduced a single-use plastic ban, but via a multi-stakeholder approach. They went beyond just saying, okay, here's the ban created by legislators. They created it within the community and as part of a sort of broader zero-waste model. So there are 4 examples that I think try and highlight maybe 4 different approaches, all of the best practices in it's about here we have ideas and tools, but they have to be tailored in each local context to be successful. That's the most important thing that I'd recommend to any local official sort of listening to this.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. And in terms of is there a trend or a theme around where the funding can come from for these transitions? Because quite often you hear that for it to be a just transition, like you said, those businesses or certain communities need support. Have those examples generally been government funded, or have they been funded by plastic polluters? How's that worked?
Yes, so far it's been government funded, basically. So you're looking at existing public budgets, or they've taken within European Union example. There is sort of more access to recovery funds that have to have a sustainable angle. So that is the major driver, but that's not sustainable. Cities shouldn't have to hugely change their budgets to introduce these policies. And of course, zero waste as a whole is cheaper because you have less waste to manage. But this is why we advocate and are trying to enforce the introduction of fully impactful EPR schemes, so there's more flow of finance to local authorities, and also we're helping connect sort of impact investors with local authorities who want to sort of fund outcomes and direct impacts. And I think there's a real shift there in terms of big investments who want to sort of maybe compromise a little bit on their returns, but know that they're putting towards a good sort of sustainable impact. So I think there's increasingly cities are looking for those opportunities as well. But so far, it's mostly come from public funding.
That's great, thanks. That's really helpful, and hopefully helpful for people listening from local government or in cities around the world. Matt, in terms of the big brands, like the role that brands like Coca-Cola need to play if we're going to truly turn the tap off when it comes to single use, what's that going to look like if they get it right and meet their targets, and how does that fit within the context of cities?
That's a great question. So Coke sells 1 out of every 5 beverages around the world. I mean, they're dominant. And the good news is that they have a very large existing refillable system. About 14% of everything they sell is currently largely in reusable bottles. They also have a small business where they do have some reusable cups for the fountain business, but that's more of a new area for them. They have a goal that they've adopted by 2030 to go to 25% of everything they sell to be in reusable bottles. So this is many billions of bottles. The Coke system sells on the order of, I think, more than 30 billion unit cases. Unit case are 24 8-ounce bottles as a historical metric the company uses all over the world. So this is a lot of bottles, right? They already sell a lot of bottles in reusable beverages containers, and they want to get up at 10%. We would ultimately like them to get towards 100%, but the initial battle is to make sure the company actually does this. Coke, unfortunately, has a history of not meeting its promises. So we're pushing on them to do so. And I think the good news is big brands like Coke, also Pepsi to a certain degree, and others, they do have the capacity to handle this, right, to do reverse logistics. And I think in cities are really the key, as I said before, because their biggest markets are in cities. Their most advanced operations are cities in Latin America and also in Southeast Asia and in the Philippines. I was just thinking, Magash, about what you were saying, and it's true. We need to, sell the idea of, Natalie, what you're pushing of people, using more reusables and, kind of moving to a reusable economy. One of the things we've realized is the key is to get the companies to do that, right? Because they're the ones who are good at selling stuff. So we're pushing the company to actually, market this and to grow this as part of their effort, which they are slowly doing, but we need all to put more pressure on them to actually do this. Because right now, as I said before, it's mainly a low cost product. They haven't figured out how to sell it to other folks as well too. The other thing I'd say is that just to add, for this is a big job issue for in cities. Because if you move from a single-use economy, right, where everything is an externality, you just throw it away, it does create jobs, and important jobs in some cities for waste pickers that can go out and actually, make some money from collecting single-use plastic products. But, it can be designed so that these individuals can make more money, and then also it can create other jobs in other cities as well too, because you create value, right? You have to get the bottles back, you have to wash them, you have to market them. There's a lot of economic potential for cities, and also just the global economy. I think that's right. There is money. There is private money. One of the things that's very frustrating to me personally, and a challenge for all of us, is that there are quote unquote, green financing in the form of green bonds. I don't know if you've all heard of these. FEMSA, the biggest bottler in the world, had almost $1 billion green bond. And they put all that money towards recycling and really, efforts to, kind of burnish their image rather than actually increase reuse. And it seems kind of, just sort of bananas to me, because, they could use this money to buy more trucks, right? More filling machines, instead they're using it to, help, do these sort of half measures in many cases in terms of trying to improve waste collection, for example, which doesn't seem to be working that well, given that only 9% of, everything, the waste produced today has been recycled. But yeah.
They've basically got a significant role to play, and there is some movement happening, but still a lot more that could be done, and they could definitely play a bigger role.
But we can push them. They can do this, right? And it's actually good for their business, right? This is good for these big brands' business to do this. That's one of the reasons why they have this goal. So we should hold them to it and push them to achieve it, and then get beyond it, which I think we think is very achievable.
No Coca-Cola on a dead planet. So for our last sort of quick-fire question, really, in one sentence, and it can be a slightly longer sentence, but generally, if you could ask one thing of the mayors, of the city leaders and the policymakers of the world in respect of our cities, what would it be? Magash?
This is going to be a very long one sentence.
Go for it.
But essentially, I would ask for two things, not just one. Take bold action now. Look at the data. We're faced with monumental challenges. So the only way we rectify this is with really bold decisions. The second is, it's easy to focus and convince youngsters at a very early age in development about what's right and wrong and how to be sustainable. And this needs to be taken into account and be made core of many of our activities. And there's a saying, it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Thanks, Magash. Jack?
Yeah, so generally I would say look at the trends. This is heading in that direction. Join us and get ahead of the game rather than sort of be late and be forced. Practically, I would say look at the economics of this. Understand and evaluate how much single-use plastic is costing the cities in terms of disposal, cleanup, and then look instead at the other economic incentives. Taxes, subsidies for reuse, all of these will help provide much more of a supportive framework to practically get you going on this journey towards, ultimately a circular zero-waste society.
Great. Thanks, Jack. Another great answer. Matt, over to you.
My message would be that reuse is an economic and political winner for the cities and the mayors, because people don't like throwing things away. And if you don't throw things away, instead you reuse them, you're going to create more jobs. You're going to have less costs for dealing with waste collection and waste issues. And you're going to have, happier voters and citizens in your city.
Nice, good, strong message to end on. So Magash, Jack, Matt, thank you so much for joining us for the Global Reuse Summit and for sharing your experience. And I know that people can find you on LinkedIn and look at the papers you've all written, the projects that you've all worked on, because there's a lot more that these guys have to offer than I could possibly have drawn out of them in 30 minutes. But I think really just the key takeaways at the end there are really strong, like action and bold action and education within our cities, looking at the data and the trends, and it being an economic and political winner. So for all of the city leaders, people involved in that who are out there, who are able to make the change, do it now. Thanks ever so much, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Floyd.